I went to a couples-only dinner. It wasn't the kind of place I frequented alone, and I still wonder why I accepted the last-minute invitation. Maybe on impulse. Maybe out of pride. Or maybe because, deep down, something inside me already sensed that this night wouldn't be just another one. It was a discreet restaurant, dimly lit, with small tables and ambient music. The kind of place where love seems to live in every lit candle. I walked in, ordered a glass of wine, and was led to the back of the room, where more private tables were located. That's when my eyes stopped. They stopped and lingered. Because there, just a few feet away, was she. My wife. Sitting across from a man I'd never seen. She was smiling. A smile I hadn't seen in our home for a long time. A smile that seemed to no longer belong to me. They clinked glasses. And as their glasses met in the air, I wondered how long it had been. Since when? Since how many nights before that? Since what small talk had turned into a confession? When did confession become desire? And when did desire become routine? I paused for a few seconds, and when I decided to approach, I saw something that killed me inside. She touched his hand across the table. The same hand that had so often held mine in silence, through good times and bad. The same hand that slid over my face in the early hours of our wedding anniversary. The same hand that promised me eternity. Her expression when she saw me was enough. She didn't need a word. There were no explanations. There was no scandal, no screams, no tears. There was only my silence. My eyes said what my mouth never needed. And her body recoiled as if the world were collapsing inside. I left the restaurant without looking back. I walked to the car. I felt the key weigh heavy in my pocket, as if it carried all the years I'd lived with her. And in that moment, I made a decision I didn't believe I had the strength to carry out. When she came home, I wouldn't be there anymore. There were no fights. There was no confrontation. Just a letter on the bed. 2 words, I wish you happiness. No hurt, no excuses, no resentment. Because when love is betrayed, it doesn't turn to hate. It just shatters. It's like a crystal on the floor. You can pick up the pieces, but it will never be the same again. That night, I slept in another place. In another world. In another reality I hadn't considered until then. And strangely, there, amidst the pain, I felt peace. For the first time in a long time, there were no doubts. Only truths. Hard, cold, and non-negotiable. Time passed. She tried to call me, text me, cried at the gate of my new home. But I didn't answer. Not because I hated her. But because there was no more space. My heart was being rebuilt. And every piece of it, now, was protected by silence. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. I missed her, of course. But the memory of her gaze at that table, touching another man's hand, was a constant reminder of what could no longer be. I moved on. Not with the triumphant manner expected of someone wounded. But with the dignity of someone who knows they can't force anyone to stay. I rebuilt myself. At my own pace. In my own way. And one day, when I least expected it, someone appeared. Someone who didn't need to compete with the past. Someone who didn't question me, but listened. Who laughed at my silences and didn't demand what I still couldn't give. And, little by little, what was emptiness became comfort. What was pain became care. And what was an end became a new beginning. I, who thought I would never love again, found myself loving again. With lightness. With truth. With reciprocity. Meanwhile, she tried to move on. She tried to build something with her lover that had already been born crooked. She tried to forget, to pretend she didn't feel my absence. But everything in her life became a comparison. No hug was the same as mine. No breakfast tasted the same. No conversation flowed the same way. It was as if my silence still lived in the corners of that house, in the pillows, in the drawers, in the music that played softly while she tidied the kitchen. And it was in that moment that she understood, it wasn't the relationship she'd betrayed. It was love. And it wasn't just me she'd lost. It was the version of herself that existed when she was by my side. Time, that unfailing judge, did its work. One day, we met again. She was different. Thinner. More reserved. Sadder. She said she still loved me. That she regretted it. That it was a mistake. That she missed me. That the days were gray. That the scent of my shirt was still on the bed linens. That my cup was still in the kitchen. That she couldn't throw it away. She said everything I imagined I would hear one day. And when she finished, she looked at me with teary eyes, waiting for an answer, hope, a new beginning. I took a deep breath. I took her hand and said, I missed you too, but today I love someone else. And it's not revenge, it's just life moving on. The pain on her face was like a silent knife. But I didn't flinch. Because this time, I was whole. She cried. She asked for a chance. She said she'd do everything differently. But time doesn't come back. And love, when it dies, doesn't come back. Perhaps affection remains. Memory. A bitter affection. But true love, that goes away. And takes with it everything that could have once been. Since then, she kept trying to find in other arms what only existed in mine. But she never succeeded. Because when you betray someone who truly loved you, the punishment isn't hate. It's absence. And that absence, I left. Cold, silent, and eternal. But what no one ever knew, is what really made me leave that night without saying a word. Because at that dinner, in that moment when I saw her smiling at another man, I remembered something she had said years before. Something that seemed silly at the time, but in that moment, changed everything. Something that made me understand that the betrayal, maybe it hadn't started there. And ever since, a question has been hammering away in my head. What if she had already cheated on me before, and I just didn't see it? Welcome to the channel. Here, none what kind of betrayal is romanticized or condoned. All the stories you hear are fictional, but based on real feelings, to show how betrayal destroys, scars, and changes people's lives forever. Prepare to dive into an intense story, full of twists and turns and deep emotions. Take a deep breath. Because what comes next, will shake you. They met on an ordinary autumn afternoon, the kind where the wind blows lightly but carries the feeling that something important is about to happen. He was leaving a coffee shop with a book under his arm, distracted by his own thoughts, when she hurriedly bumped into him, knocking a folder full of papers to the floor. It was the kind of accident that usually yields only an apology and a quick glance, but that day, in that moment, time seemed to slow down. She smiled lightly at his nervous attempt to help her, and he lost himself in the way her eyes curved when she smiled. They exchanged brief, shy words, and a week later they were sitting together in the same cafe, sharing stories as if they had known each other for years. His name was Daniel, hers was Laura. And since then, almost without realizing it, their paths went from being parallel to intertwining into a single line. Daniel was a calm, observant man who valued silence as much as words. He had a way of looking at people that made people feel heard even before they spoke, and this always impressed Laura, who came from relationships where listening was scarce and words were often superficial. He was an architect, detail-oriented, passionate about building spaces that carried soul, and perhaps because of this, he also knew how to build bonds with care. Laura was intense, spontaneous, and carried in her gaze the strength of someone who had lived too much for her young age. A psychologist, she was one of those who delved deeply into the pain of others, but sometimes forgot to consider her own. When they were together, there was a kind of silent harmony between them. He brought stability to her inner chaos, and she awakened in him a freedom he didn't even know he desired. The relationship evolved quickly, but unhurriedly. They respected each other's pace. Their conversations, always deep, were followed by comfortable silences. Within a few months, they knew each other's routines, vices, fears, and quirks by heart. He liked to wake up early on Sundays and make pancakes. She preferred to stay in bed listening to music, but always came downstairs smiling when she smelled the coffee. He left notes on the mirror with quotes from movies they'd seen together, and she responded with hearts drawn in the margins of the newspapers he read. It wasn't a movie love. It was real. Made of small gestures and subtle sacrifices. There were also disagreements, as in every relationship. But they were overcome through dialogue, with that maturity rarely found in short stories. Over time, they decided to live together. They found a modest apartment, but full of windows and natural light, just as Daniel liked. She decorated the room with colorful pillows, he set up a bookshelf for her books. They shared their days, their spaces, their rituals. Birthdays began to be celebrated with simple, intimate dinners, Sundays became sacred for marathons of old movies, and life's problems became less burdensome when shared between the two of them. Families blended. Friends learned to speak of themselves in the plural. And for years, life continued like this, at a pace where the bad days didn't cancel out the good, and affection always found a way to overcome fatigue, pressure, and disagreements. Daniel dedicated himself to his work with an admirable work ethic, but he never let demands steal his time from what truly mattered. Lara, on the other hand, sometimes carried her patient's pain in her chest, but found in Daniel the comfort that reminded her that she, too, had a right to care. They had plans. Of trips, of home renovations, of adopting a puppy, perhaps one day, who knows, of having children. But these plans sat in a corner of the bookshelf, next to the photography books he loved so much and the journals she'd kept since adolescence. It wasn't a perfect relationship. No one saw hearts fluttering around them as they walked hand in hand down the street. But there was something rare, respect. There was mutual admiration, and a trust built day after day, made of conscious choices, not empty promises. Sometimes they argued over trivial matters. Sometimes they remained silent for longer than they would have liked. But they returned. They always returned to each other, as if the world outside were too big and only within four walls could they be whole. Friends said they completed each other. Others said they balanced each other. They themselves didn't quite know what they were. They only knew they made sense together. Over the years, however, some things changed. Daniel began to isolate himself a little more. Not out of coldness, but out of a weariness he himself didn't understand. He began going out less, talking less. Lara, always sensitive, noticed, but didn't know how to help. She tried to make conversation, to bring lightness, but sometimes he seemed elsewhere. Even so, he remained present in the details, he still left the coffee ready, still worried if she slept well, still hugged her tightly in the cold early mornings. Lara, in turn, began to feel a restlessness she couldn't name. A strange emptiness on days when everything should be fine. And, little by little, without realizing it, she began to seek within herself what she once found in him. She began to go out more with friends, get involved in new projects, spend more time away from home. Not because she didn't love him, but perhaps because she no longer knew where she fit into that comfortable routine that, little by little, began to suffocate. They still loved each other. In different ways, perhaps less intensely, but they still loved each other. But time is relentless with details. And the details began to fade. The kisses became shorter, the conversations more matter-of-fact. The laughter no longer echoed off the walls as much. There were no arguments, no obvious distance. Just a kind of haze between them, as if they were there, but not completely. As if they had become roommates, more than life partners. Friends, more than lovers. Lara began to feel lonely, even when he was by her side. She tried to recapture old memories, plan trips, propose changes to their routine, but sometimes Daniel reacted with a weariness that frustrated her. He, on the other hand, blamed himself for no longer being able to express his feelings with intensity. He wanted to be present, but felt lost within himself. Neither of them knew exactly where everything began to slip. Maybe it was that fall, when he forgot their anniversary for the first time. Maybe it was that night she cried in the bathroom and he didn't notice. Maybe it was somewhere between the piling bills and the stretched silences. Still, no one spoke of the end. Because neither of them wanted to end it. It was easier to continue pretending the love still lived there. And in a way, it still did. But it wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't the kind of love that warms in the cold or intoxicates with laughter on any given Tuesday. It was a more sober, more discreet, more restrained love. A love that still made coffee, but no longer said, "I love you," with its eyes. A love that endured, but that, little by little, ceased to live. And it was in this atmosphere of silence and confusion that something happened. Something that hadn't yet been said aloud, but was already beginning to take shape between the lines. The kind of thing that changes the course of everything. That shatters what seemed solid. That rips the blindfold off and exposes truths no one wanted to see. But for now, there was still time. Time to try. Time to feel. Time to love, even if differently. Because the final period hadn't been written yet. Not yet. But something was already about to begin. Time had taught Daniel and Lara to live in a kind of silent equilibrium, where every gesture seemed pre-planned and every conversation followed predictable scripts. There were no frequent fights, no excessive displays of affection. Just the routine, shaped by the years, flowing between them like a steady tide that sometimes brought back sweet memories, but mostly only washed away the small fragments of what had once been passion. Lara continued to wake up before leaving for the office, drink the same hurried coffee, grab the same leather bag, and leave with a kiss on the forehead to Daniel, who was already sitting at the table with the newspaper open, as he did every day. It was as if they lived in a theater where the roles were so rehearsed that no one bothered to improvise anymore. But in the silences between the memorized lines, there were holes. Holes that grew larger with each passing day. Lara started arriving a little later. She had simple explanations: patients who were extending their appointments, last-minute meetings, more traffic jams. Nothing that seemed unusual. She had always been dedicated to her career, and Daniel had never been the controlling type. He trusted her. He trusted her like one trusts the air they breathe. And this trust was so solid that he didn't even consider questioning it. But something began to shift inside him. Not an obvious jealousy, nor an immediate distrust. It was more subtle, more instinctive. A feeling that something wasn't where it should be. That her footsteps sounded different, that her perfume took longer to fade from her clothes when she returned home, that her eyes sought places where he no longer was. He tried to ignore it. He tried to believe it was simply a result of the distance that time created between people, even those who loved each other. Lara, for her part, was immersed in doubts she couldn't even name. It wasn't that she'd stopped loving Daniel. Love, for her, still existed. But it felt tired, worn, like a book reread so many times it no longer surprises. And it was in the midst of this weariness that she met someone. Someone who appeared unexpectedly, almost banally. An acquaintance from a reading group, someone who frequented the same cafes as her, who shared similar ideas about art and music, and who, above all, listened to her with a level of attention she hadn't felt in a long time. It was just a conversation here, a text exchange there, a compliment disguised as a matter of course. Lara wasn't looking for anything, but she felt alive in that man's words. And before she knew it, she was already looking forward to his messages more than her conversations with Daniel. His name was Roberto, but that didn't matter yet. What mattered was what he sparked in her. The kind of interest that ignited something Lara thought had disappeared. They began to meet in subtle ways. A coffee at the end of the workday, a walk after a lecture, any excuse that, little by little, became a habit. She felt young with him, felt seen, desired. And that, even with the weight of guilt, made her smile to herself in the mirror. The conflict within her grew. She knew there were no excuses, that Daniel was a good man, loyal, present. But what to do when your heart screams for something new while your reason clings to what is right? Lara tried to convince herself it wasn't cheating, yet. That she could still stop. That everything was under control. But it wasn't. Daniel began to notice the small signs. A louder laugh when responding to messages, an unusual rush to leave the house, an emotional absence that became increasingly difficult to ignore. They weren't fights, nor accusations. They were silences that screamed. And even without proof, Daniel began to pull away. Not out of dislike, but out of self-defense. He began spending more time away, accepting invitations to events he'd previously declined. And the more he withdrew, the freer Lara felt to reach out to the new. It was a silent dance between them, he trying to understand what he was losing, she trying to hide what she was finding. The climax came on an ordinary weekend. Daniel had been invited by a couple of friends to a private dinner, a couples-only gathering, and without much thought, he decided to go. It was an unusual gesture, but something inside him urged him to break the routine. Lara, in turn, said she had an after-hours shift, a special occasion, and he believed her. He always believed. But what Daniel didn't know was that in that same restaurant, at that same dinner, Lara would also be there. Only with another man. And when he entered the dining room, guided by the waiter to his table, his eyes scanned the room as if searching for something, unsure what. Until they stopped. And found it. She was sitting with Roberto, laughing. Laughing like she hadn't laughed in ages. She touched his hand naturally. The intimacy between them was evident. Daniel froze for a second. The ground seemed to drop from under his feet. It wasn't anger he felt. Nor fury. It was a cold emptiness that spread throughout his body. He stood there, staring at the scene, until she saw him. Lara's eyes widened, the color drained from her face, and her hand suddenly pulled away from Roberto's. But it was too late. Daniel had already understood everything. He walked toward the table unhurriedly, as if he already knew the fate of his own pain. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. A look that hurt more than any scream. A look that said it was all over. Lara mumbled his name, tried to get up, but Daniel had already turned his back. He left the restaurant without looking back. Outside, the air seemed denser, as if even the world weighed differently. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove aimlessly through the streets until the city fell asleep. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just felt. A pain that was silent, but devastating. He returned home in the middle of the night. He packed a few things, left a letter on the bed. And left. When Lara arrived home the next day, she found the silence she had already feared. The closet half open, his clothes missing, his scent almost gone. The letter folded beside her pillow. Just 2 words, "I wish you happiness." She read it and felt her chest burn. She cried, tried calling, texting, but got no response. He had left with the same grace with which he loved her. No scandal, no revenge. He simply withdrew. And in that absence, something began to blossom within her. An emptiness that wasn't just Daniel's, but her own. Because now, with his silence, she no longer knew who she was. And deep down, she knew she had lost much more than a marriage. But what she didn't yet know, was what truly motivated Daniel to get up from that table that night and move on. Because there was something in that scene, something in her eyes, or perhaps in the words they'd exchanged beforehand, that triggered a memory. A dormant memory. Something that, when resurfaced, would change everything she thought about that betrayal, and about who had truly been betrayed first. Time passed in a blur for Lara. The days lost their shape, the nights became dull. She still woke expecting the familiar sound of the coffee maker turning, the smell of bread warming in the pan, the soft sound of newspaper pages turning. But all she found was a crushing silence. Daniel's absence filled every room in the house, as if he had taken the very air she breathed with him. She tried to resume her routine, return to her office, occupy her mind, pretend she was fine. But the emptiness that inhabited her was greater than any distraction. She sent long messages, wrote letters, called dozens of times, until she finally understood he wouldn't return. And not because she no longer felt anything, but because something inside her had broken. And that rupture was irreparable. That was when she decided to go to his mother's house. She needed to talk to someone, needed to understand if there was any chance, any sign that would give her the strength to persist. Daniel's mother welcomed her with the same kindness as always, but there was something different in her eyes. A restrained affection, a silent pain at seeing her son hurt. They sat at the table on the porch, drinking tea slowly. Lara cried softly, confessing her mistake, her regret, how much she wanted to go back. Her mother-in-law listened empathetically, but without making any promises. She simply said that Daniel was rebuilding his life elsewhere, and that perhaps, in time, he would be willing to talk. And it was this opening that Lara seized with all her might. She spent weeks trying to find out where he was, until a mutual friend, unaware of the whole story, casually mentioned that Daniel had been seen in a bookstore on the other side of town, accompanied by a woman. Her name was Sophia. Lara didn't know it yet, but she would soon. A simple woman with a calm smile and a gentle presence. The opposite of everything Lara was at that moment. Sophia came into Daniel's life without asking for space, and perhaps that's why she gained so much. She didn't pressure him, didn't demand anything, didn't remind him of everything that hurt. She was simply there, patient, listening, and truthful. They met by chance, at an architecture event, and the connection was so natural that, for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt no pressure to start something new. And before he knew it, they were already sharing coffee, stories, and pain-free silences. Lara discovered Sophia by scouring, without admitting it to anyone, the social media accounts of their old mutual friends. Travel photos, sincere smiles, hugs she knew well. And there, before that bright screen, regret took a form she hadn't felt before, that of seeing the love that was hers being lived by another. She then decided to do the unthinkable. She sent him a message, asking to talk. Not to ask for him back, but to apologize. Daniel didn't respond immediately. It took days, maybe weeks. But one day, he agreed. They arranged to meet in a park, a neutral place, far from her memories. Lara arrived first, tense, her heart racing. When she saw him coming toward her, calmer, more mature, she felt small. He greeted her with a brief hug, not cold, but also not nostalgic. They sat on the bench and were silent for a few moments. She was the first to speak. She told him she had made a mistake, that she had let herself be carried away by a moment of fragility, that now she understood what she had lost. She said she expected nothing from him, she just wanted to be forgiven, because she carried a guilt she could no longer bear. Daniel listened attentively. There was a distant tenderness in his eyes, as if the pain had been worked through long ago. When she finished, he held her hand and said he had already forgiven her. That he felt no anger, no hurt, only sadness. That he had spent a long time trying to understand where they had lost their way, until he realized that perhaps the mistake hadn't started with the betrayal, but long before that. And it was at that moment that something in the tone of the conversation changed. Lara looked at him confused, wondering what he meant. Daniel hesitated for a second, but then decided to tell her. Not out of revenge, but out of emotional justice. Because there was something she needed to know, something that might explain, in a cruel way, why he had left without a fight. He said that night at the restaurant, when he saw her with the other man, something inside him made a strange connection. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt him, it was a specific memory. A phrase she had said years before, one night when they were watching a movie. She had commented, almost without thinking, that she had never loved anyone as much as she loved Daniel, but that once, years before, she had fallen in love with someone in a relationship, and it had destroyed her. At the time, he hadn't paid any attention. But that night, seeing the way she looked at that man, the touch, the complicity, it all seemed familiar. And then he remembered the name. The man's name. Roberto. The same man who, years ago, had been Daniel's colleague on a project. A man he had introduced to her at an event, long before they started dating. And the truth came crashing down, she had already been involved with Roberto before they even began their relationship. Lara paled. The memory came like a slap. Yes, she had met Roberto before. And yes, there had been something between them. Something brief, intense, forbidden. But she swore Daniel had never known. That it was a buried secret. And now, there, sitting across from the man she had loved more than any other, she saw in his eyes confirmation that everything was connected. That recent betrayal wasn't just a falling out. It was a repetition. A continuation. And Daniel knew. He knew she had chosen, once again, the same man. And that, more than the betrayal, was what destroyed the bond between them. The certainty that he had never been the only one. That there was always a space, however small, reserved for another. Lara tried to explain, tried to say she hadn't planned it, that it was a coincidence, that she didn't want to relive anything with Roberto, that she simply felt heard, desired. But the words rang hollow. Daniel looked at her with an almost cruel calm. He said he didn't hate her, that he understood her weaknesses, but that she needed to accept one truth: she had chosen. Twice. You chose a past over the present, and then you chose to relive that past at the most vulnerable moment in your relationship. And that kind of choice has a price. She cried. She begged for forgiveness again, but this time, not with words. With a look. With presence. But Daniel just stood up. He said he was at peace now. That he loved someone else. And that he hoped that one day, Lara would love herself enough to stop repeating hurtful patterns. She sat there for hours. The wind blew slowly. People hurried past. And for the first time, she understood what true emptiness was. Not just the emptiness of Daniel's absence. But the knowledge that she had lost the love of her life, by persisting in a mistake that already had a name, a face, and a history. And it was at that moment that she realized that not all forgiveness brings back what was lost. Some only allow us to understand what will never be ours again. Lara walked home unable to feel her own footsteps. She walked as if floating on fragile, unstable ground, about to give way with each memory that echoed in her mind. The wooden park bench where they'd spoken still seemed marked with the pain of that reunion. Each of Daniel's words reverberated within her with cruel clarity. It wasn't just his forgiveness that tore her apart, but his firmness as he looked into her eyes and assured her he was at peace. That calm he demonstrated suffocated her more than any shout of rage could have. It meant he had truly left her behind. The us she, for a belated moment, had tried to reclaim, no longer existed. He had moved on. She had not. Inside the apartment, everything seemed in its place, but everything was wrong. His favorite cup was still in the closet, where she'd never had the courage to move it. The shirts he'd forgotten remained tucked away in the back of the drawer, still folded the way he liked them. The plants, once watered diligently on Sunday mornings, now wilted, as if sensing his absence as well. She sat on the living room floor, among the cushions, unsure of how long she'd been there, staring into space, trying to grasp the exact moment she'd begun to lose him. But there wasn't a single instant. It was an accumulation of omissions, silences, distractions, and, ultimately, choices that could no longer be undone. Across town, Daniel was making coffee while Sophia sorted through books on the new bookshelf in the apartment they now shared. There was a routine there that was different from the previous one. A tranquility without pressure, without painful memories. When he returned from work, Sophia greeted him with sincere smiles, and their conversations flowed as if they had always been there. She didn't carry the weight of the past, and that soothed him. But that day, after his reunion with Lara, something in him weighed more heavily than usual. Sophia noticed. She sat beside him on the sofa, held his hand, and gently told him he didn't need to explain anything. But he wanted to. He told her about the meeting, about the revelation, about how everything fit together now. He said he felt angry at himself for taking so long to understand, for having trusted too much, for having ignored the signs. But he also confessed that, at that moment, looking at Lara, he felt something he hadn't expected, pity. Not out of superiority, but because he knew she would live with that knowledge forever. Sophia listened to him in silence, without interrupting. When he finished, she hugged him in a way that made him realize that there, finally, he was being loved with maturity and truth. Without empty promises. Without competition with shadows from the past. In the days that followed, Lara tried to start over. She avoided going out, declined invitations, and distanced herself from friends. She felt shame, regret, and a kind of pain that no therapy session could alleviate. One afternoon, sitting alone in a cafe she used to frequent with Daniel, she saw, reflected in the window, an image that pierced her like a blade, a couple laughing, sharing headphones. That simplicity, that spontaneous exchange, brought back memories of a day when she and Daniel did exactly the same, sitting there in the same corner. It was the first time she felt forgotten. Because even if you didn't know who those people were, you understood that love continues, even when we think it should stop because of us. Determined to end the cycles that still held her back, Lara sought out Roberto. She needed to understand why she had allowed him to return to her life so easily, why she had let herself be carried away by something that had caused pain in the past. They arranged to meet at a discreet restaurant, away from the eyes of strangers. When he arrived, she was surprised by his naturalness. It was as if nothing had happened. He spoke lightly, talking about recent trips, new projects, as if he had no blame for the outcome of her story with Daniel. Lara watched him silently. She saw that the brilliance that had once enchanted her now seemed superficial. His charm now felt like artifice. And when he smiled and reached across the table to touch her hand, as he had so many times, she pulled it away. She firmly told him that it would not happen again. That he was not responsible for everything, but that, with him, she had betrayed not only Daniel, but herself. Roberto seemed surprised, but showed no regret. He simply said she needed to learn to manage her emotions better. That hit her like a blow. For the first time, she felt disgust for the man in front of her. She got up, paid the bill, and left without looking back. That night, she cried again, but not for Daniel, nor for Roberto. She cried for herself. For the woman who had lost herself trying to fill a void she couldn't quite grasp. Meanwhile, Daniel immersed himself deeper into his new life. Sophia knew his silences, his fears, his reservations. And she respected them all. Little by little, he began to leave Lara in the past. His conversations with Sophia became more intimate, his decisions more shared, his plans more realistic. One night, at dinner with friends, he held her hand under the table and felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. He realized he no longer needed to compare. The love he experienced now wasn't a substitute. It was construction. It was new. And most importantly, it was mutual. Weeks later, Lara received a photo in a message. It was from an old friend, with no intention of hurting her. He simply wanted to share some news. Daniel and Sophia had gotten engaged. The image showed them holding hands, smiling in front of the sea. There was no luxury, no ostentation. Just simple, raw, real happiness. She clutched the phone tightly, her heart racing. She stood still for minutes. And then she smiled. A sad, lonely, but genuine smile. Because, in that moment, she understood that he had found what she had destroyed. And more than that, he had found someone who knew how to care for what she had once let slip through his fingers. The next morning, Lara stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. She saw her own wrinkles, the marks of fatigue, her sunken eyes. But she also saw a woman who, despite everything, was alive. Who had learned the hard way the value of truth, loyalty, and the silence of a broken heart. She turned off her phone for a few days, distanced herself from social media, and immersed herself in work with a new purpose. Not to forget Daniel, but to rebuild herself. Now, without distractions, without false starts, without seeking in others what she needed to find within herself. And deep down, she knew that story would never have a happy ending for them both. Because sometimes, love isn't enough to stay. Sometimes, you have to lose everything to finally understand what you had. And she understood. Too late. But she understood. The days following the announcement of Daniel and Sophia's engagement were like a silent grieving process for Lara, but not the explosive kind, filled with anger, tears, and desperate phone calls. It was a dry, intimate grief, the kind you can't see but feel in every restrained gesture, in every interrupted thought, in every attempt at a new beginning that dies before it even begins. She didn't try to reach out to him. Not a message, not a letter. He knew there was nothing more to say. Everything that could be saved had already been destroyed by his own hands, and now all that remained was the responsibility of rebuilding herself, stone by stone, without anyone's help. But the knowledge of what she had lost wouldn't leave her alone, because now she knew, with the clarity that only comes when it's too late, that not everything is reparable, and that not all roads lead back home. Lara began avoiding the places they used to frequent together. The cafes, the squares, the small neighborhood movie theaters. These spaces now seemed too fraught to be inhabited again, as if the memories there were invisible walls pushing her away. In her office, she immersed herself in her work with an almost obsessive intensity. She saw more patients than her emotional state could handle, and when she wasn't listening to other people's stories, she wrote compulsively in old notebooks. About guilt, about love, about life-changing decisions. She wrote as a way to process what she never got to say to Daniel, as if each page were a silent apology that would never be delivered. Meanwhile, on the other side of a completely different life, Daniel breathed freely. Mornings with Sophia were light, filled with spontaneous conversations and plans that slowly blossomed. The bond that formed between them wasn't as intense as an overwhelming passion, but solid as a root that spreads discreetly underground. She knew his silences, respected his space, and loved him without asking questions about what came before. Daniel, in turn, felt whole for the first time in years. Someone who didn't need to mince words, who didn't carry the constant feeling that something was about to break. The trauma he'd experienced with Lara hadn't disappeared, but it was no longer an open wound. It was a scar that hurt on cold days but no longer bled. And even with this apparent peace, there was a part of Daniel that, from time to time, was visited by a subtle restlessness. It wasn't longing. It was more of an unanswered question, a mix of curiosity and melancholy. A question that always came silently: how would she be now? Not because he still longed for her presence, but because he wondered if she had finally managed to understand. To understand not only the pain she had caused, but also the magnitude of the choice she had made. Daniel knew it wasn't the kind of pain that passes quickly, nor is it overcome with distractions. It was one of those pains one learns to carry, like a permanent memory that lodges itself in one's shoulders, constantly reminding one of what was lost through recklessness or negligence. Lara, for her part, tried to live with dignity. She didn't want pity, nor comfort. Her reconstruction wasn't an attempt to win anyone back, but to avoid disappearing into her own shame. She began to return to old hobbies she'd abandoned. She started painting again, taking long walks at dusk, listening to music without lyrics so as not to be affected by the words. She tried to find new meanings for herself. She no longer sought men to hide in, nor arms to forget herself. For the first time in a long time, she was facing the emptiness head-on, without trying to fill it with distractions. And this, as painful as it was also liberating. One drizzly afternoon, walking distractedly through a street market, Lara happened to see a scene that tore her apart. A father and a small child playing around a children's book stand. The man laughed, the girl hugged his legs with the innocence of someone who hasn't yet grasped the weight of the world. And for a split second, Lara wondered what her life would have been like if she hadn't broken that love. If, instead of seeking something outside, she had tried to take better care of what she had. Not because she wanted children at that moment, but because, in that gesture of care between father and daughter, she saw the kind of bond she and Daniel were building before everything fell apart. The kind of bond that forms when two people choose to stay. And she didn't. A moral dilemma began to grow within her. How could she forgive herself for a mistake that couldn't be fixed? How could she move on knowing that the other person's happiness was, in part, made possible precisely by her absence? There was something profoundly cruel in that realization. Knowing that the man she loved was now better, more whole, happier, without her. And knowing that, for that to be possible, she had to leave his life in such a devastating way. That was the dilemma, accepting that the fairest outcome for both of them was precisely the separation she had caused. And that required a kind of maturity that was painful to achieve. A few months later, Lara was invited to attend a lecture on human relations, hosted by an old college classmate. He reluctantly accepted, but went. He needed to get out of his hiding place. During the event, one of the speakers talked about how certain choices haunt us, but also teach us to be more whole people. How regret can fuel change, not just endless punishment. Lara listened attentively, as if in front of a mirror. At the end, he approached the woman and thanked her. For the first time, he felt there was room within himself to embrace his own humanity. Not to justify what he did, but to understand that he had to move on despite the guilt. Daniel, meanwhile, was preparing for the wedding. It was an intimate ceremony, attended only by close friends. There was no ostentation, only delicacy. On the eve of the big day, he walked alone through a garden near Sophia's house. He needed a moment to himself. He remembered all the paths that had led him here. The sleepless nights, the piercing silence of betrayal, the pain of having to leave a home he had built. But now, as he looked to the horizon, everything seemed as distant as another time. Lara was part of history, but no longer of the present. She was a page turned. A lesson. And although a part of him would always harbor a shadow of that pain, there was no longer room for longing. Only gratitude for having survived. And somewhere in the city, on a random night, Lara sat in front of the mirror and wrote in her journal. Simple but necessary words. She wrote about love, about choices, about losses that define who we become. She closed the notebook, lit a candle, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with herself. Not because there was a fix. But because, finally, there was acceptance. The silence that followed was no longer one of absence, but of maturity. That stillness that only comes when you understand that some stories don't end with reconciliation, but with understanding. And that sometimes, the true happy ending lies in recognizing that we are no longer the same, and that this, in itself, can be a new beginning. The wedding morning dawned with unusual serenity. The sky was slightly cloudy, and the breeze blew warm, as if nature had decided to match the tranquil tone of the day. Daniel woke early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. He made his coffee as he did every day, letting the aroma fill the room with a comforting familiarity. Sophia was still asleep, her face partially covered by the sheet, her hair spread across the pillow in a soft chaos he had grown to admire. Watching her sleep had been almost a ritual for him these past few months, a silent reminder that life, even after so many brokennesses, could still be kind. He kissed her lightly on the forehead and went for a short walk before beginning the preparations. At the small neighborhood flower shop, Daniel stopped and asked for white lilies. It wasn't the flower he would traditionally choose, but there was something about their simplicity that touched him. He took the bouquet, thanked her, and as he left, he was startled by a familiar voice. Not a call, but a question from behind, timid, almost hesitant, as if asking permission to exist there. When he turned, he found Lara. She looked different. Her eyes were more mature, her expression more restrained, she wore neutral clothing, her hair tied back simply. For a moment, they were both silent. She held an envelope in her hands, but kept her arms lowered, as if unsure if she had the courage to hand it over. Daniel took a deep breath, not out of discomfort, but in an effort to maintain the balance he had achieved. She spoke first, her voice calm but hesitant. She said she didn't want to interfere with his day, that she'd learned of the wedding by chance, but that she needed to see him first. She said she had no intention of interrupting anything, but that there was something she needed to say, and that only now, after everything, could she understand clearly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at the lilies in her hands, then at her. Her eyes were teary, but there was no despair, only a serene melancholy, like someone who had accepted a loss but still needed to face her own truths before letting them go. Then she held out the envelope. She said she'd written a letter weeks ago but hadn't known how to deliver it. That it contained words she'd never had the courage to say before. That it wasn't an attempt at rapprochement, but simply an outburst. A way to free him, and perhaps, free herself as well. Daniel took the letter carefully, looked into her eyes, and, in a voice that carried more maturity than emotion, thanked her. He said he would read it, but later. That at that moment, he had made a choice, and that choice was now the only thing that mattered. Lara nodded. She didn't try to hug him or prolong the conversation. She simply thanked him for listening, turned, and walked slowly down the sidewalk, disappearing into the street trees as if he had never been there. Daniel stood there for a while, holding the lilies in one hand and the letter in the other. He knew that opening it now might affect the clarity he had so painstakingly cultivated, so he tucked the envelope into his inside jacket pocket, promising himself he would only read it when everything was calm again. Hours later, the wedding took place with the simplicity and beauty he and Sophia had planned. An intimate ceremony, few guests, a low-key celebration in a garden surrounded by sunflowers. The promises exchanged between them were made with a sincerity that required no grandeur, just presence. When Daniel said yes, he did so not as someone wanting to forget the past, but as someone who finally understood that moving forward is different from erasing. Sophia, as she placed the ring on his finger, looked into his eyes with a soft smile, as if she knew exactly where she was going, and yet chose to continue. The next day, Daniel woke before sunrise. He rose quietly, grabbed the letter from his jacket pocket hanging on the chair, and left silently. He sat on a bench in the garden, the same one where he used to have coffee with Sophia on weekends. He opened the envelope carefully, as if each fold carried an ancient weight. Lara's handwriting was familiar, but there was a fragility he didn't remember seeing before. She began the letter by talking about time. How it teaches us to see what was previously invisible. How it silences pride and amplifies consciousness. She wrote that she didn't expect redemption, nor applause for finally seeing, but that she now understood that loving someone isn't just about feeling, it's about caring. And that she didn't care. She spoke of fear. About how the fear of being forgotten made her run into the arms of someone who symbolized the past, as if trying to prove she still had value. She said it wasn't desire that made her betray him, but the cowardice of facing what was already being lost. That Roberto wasn't the reason, but the symptom. That the betrayal began long before bed, when she stopped listening, looking him in the eye, asking if he was still happy. She said she now understood that true love requires presence, and that she had been withdrawing, little by little, without realizing it. She spoke of the pain of seeing him move on, not out of jealousy, but because she understood that he could only be fulfilled, away from her. And that, as much as it hurt, it was fair. The letter ended with a simple sentence: if I had understood before, it might still have been too late. But now I accept it. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a slight pang in his chest. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of bittersweet peace. The certainty that, even with all the mistakes, there had been love. In a crooked, flawed way, but real. He folded the letter, put it back in his pocket, and stood up. He entered the house and found Sophia in the kitchen, making coffee. He hugged her from behind, whispered good morning, and gently kissed her shoulder. She smiled without asking questions. She knew he had found what he needed in that morning silence. Lara, for her part, found something different in that act of surrender. When she dropped that letter, she felt as if her heart had been emptied of an old weight. For the first time in years, he looked at her without judgment. She was alone, but no longer empty. She knew her story with Daniel had ended long before it did, but now she understood why. And that was what finally allowed her to write a new page, without trying to erase the previous ones. That night, he returned to the painting studio he had abandoned and began a new painting. The colors were soft, the lines uncertain, but there was something there that hadn't been there before: sincerity. Time would pass, as always. And each of them would encounter new challenges, new pain, new joys. But through everything they experienced, something remained intact, the memory of a love that was real, even when it was lost. And maybe, just maybe, this is the kind of love that transforms us most, the one that finally teaches us how to truly love. A few months had passed since Daniel and Sophia's wedding, and life now moved at a different pace. It was as if the clock's hands had finally aligned with Daniel's heart. The mornings no longer carried the weight of what had been, and the eyes that once searched for traces of the past now turned to the present, attentive to what they were building together, brick by brick, with care and truth. Sophia was the kind of person who didn't ask for space, yet still occupied it. She didn't talk about what Daniel had experienced before her, but she knew how to recognize the days when his silence came from somewhere deeper. She never tried to replace what had passed, simply choosing to be there fully, and that was what made Daniel feel whole again. Little by little, he smiled again in a way that was unrestrained. He looked in the mirror again and recognized his own reflection without seeing shadows behind him. The home they built was simple, but alive. Full of soft music, new scents, and conversations that held no urgency. Daniel found himself feeling lighter around her, not because he had forgotten the past, but because he had put it exactly where it belonged, in the past. Lara, on the other hand, continued her slower but more steady path. She had made loneliness her ally, no longer her enemy. Little by little, she began to open up spaces for other people, but not in search of love, but rather of reconnecting with herself. She grew closer to her mother, with whom she had lost connection over the years. She rebuilt a friendship with a college friend with whom she had broken off out of pride. She allowed herself to smile without guilt, and when homesickness overwhelmed her, she wrote. Her words became anonymous posts on online forums, where others saw themselves reflected in her pain and her attempt at rebirth. She gradually discovered that there was a way to transform guilt into learning, and even without repair, she found purpose. An invitation to speak on emotional responsibility arrived by email, and on impulse, she accepted. She took the stage trembling, her voice weak in the first few words, but then it grew, until she shared her story with such raw honesty that the audience's silence was almost reverent. In the end, she was applauded not for being a victim, but for having the courage to acknowledge her mistakes without hiding behind excuses. That night marked a new turning point. For the first time, she understood that what she had lost was irretrievable, but that there was still much to be lived truthfully, even with the rubble of what she had failed to preserve. Roberto, for his part, followed the predictable path of those who live in repetitive cycles. The enchantment that had kept him moving through different relationships gradually lost its luster, until it became chronic fatigue. He tried to stay in the spotlight, maintain a semblance of control, but deep inside, the intact vanity that used to guide him was no longer there. When he learned of Daniel's marriage, he laughed it off as if it were a bad joke, but days later, alone at home, staring at his own distorted image in the mirror of a cold bathroom, he realized he had become an echo. Without true ties, without roots, and increasingly distant from what he once pretended to be. His lack of regret didn't prevent the emptiness from arriving, and when it did, it encountered no resistance. It was just him, and the weight of what he never built. He was seen, months later, at an alumni reunion, alone, less proud, less talkative. He tried to talk to a few people, but his words no longer held the same force. He seemed tired of himself. And perhaps he was. Daniel, now with Sophia by his side, experienced a new kind of peace. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't illusion. It was the tranquility of knowing he was with someone who chose him every day consciously, not out of need. Life continued with its responsibilities, its difficulties, its challenges, but there was a new perspective on everything. His relationships with friends were restored, with new contours. He returned to old places, but now with memories redefined. No longer to forget, but to show himself that he could be there without being hurt. Sophia encouraged him to reconnect with his old projects, and this rekindled something dormant in him, the desire to create. He began drawing again, not for others, but for pleasure. The act of building something with his own hands had always defined him, and now, more than ever, he did it with conviction. One night, while they were together on the porch, Sophia mentioned that she would like to travel with him to the countryside, spend a few days away from it all, disconnected. He smiled and said he would love to. But before entering, he turned to her and said there was something he needed to show her. He took a drawing from his desk. It was a house. Simple, yet full of subtle details. She looked at it curiously, and he explained that it was a plan for a place where he would like to grow old with her. Sophia, moved, simply hugged him. In that embrace, there was more than love. There was reconstruction, truth, and, above all, choice. And Lara, in another corner of the same world, watched all this from afar. Not through social media, but through life. She felt the cycle inevitably closing. Not with pain, but with a kind of reverence for the story she had lived and which she was now learning to let go of. She began working with emotional support groups, helping women experiencing emotional loss. She used her story as a starting point, not as the protagonist, and this freed her from the role of eternal regretter. She understood that life doesn't always offer the chance to start over with the one we love, but it always offers the opportunity to become someone better than we were. And that, ultimately, is what truly matters. The story of Daniel, Lara, and Sophia is more than a tale of love, loss, and reunion. It's a mirror for everyone who, at some point, believed that love was enough to keep someone by their side. The truth is that love, without responsibility, without daily choices, without care, falls apart. And once broken, it can't always be put back together. Betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person, it destroys the betrayer as well. It tears apart invisible bonds that take years to build. It rips from the soul the capacity for trust, and in its place, leaves a void that's hard to fill. No one emerges unscathed. No one remains the same. If you've come this far, with a heavy heart, you may have experienced some of these pains yourself. Maybe you know someone who has. Maybe you're experiencing it now. Comment below what you thought of this story, if it touched you, and what part impacted you most. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving stories like this, which make us think, feel, and reflect on the life we're building. And remember, this channel does not condone any kind of betrayal. All the stories told here are fiction, but they carry a real message, that love needs to be protected, cultivated, and respected. Because when we betray, we're not just hurting the person by our side. We're destroying what could have been the most beautiful thing in our lives. Think about that.